Today's daf is daf nun, round number. We'll start on the bottom of daf mem tesamid base. It's one of those shirim, one of those dafim where you need a whiteboard to write this all down. And it's all a continuation of yesterday's sugya about how to calculate if you derive B from A through whatever method, there are four possibilities, then can you derive C from B? So davar halamed mehekesh. All right, so B derived its halacha from A through a hekesh. Choser umalamed bekal v'chomer. Now B can teach C through a kal v'chomer, and that we know from on the top of daf nun midatana debei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel gives us a whole list of rules, of regulations, of exegesis, and how we derive halachas. And one of those rules is that if you derive B through a hekesh, then C could be derived from B with a kal v'chomer. However, davar halamed behekesh, if again the same scenario that we said before, that B derives its halacha from A through a hekesh, and now you want to pass on to C through not a kal v'chomer but a binyan av, mahu she'alamed b'binyan av. The Gemara vacillates on this question because a binyan av is not as powerful as a kal v'chomer, meaning, as we'll soon see in the sugya over and over again, kal v'chomer is very, very powerful. I don't know, it's probably number one on the list, vying with gzeira shava. Hekesh and binyan av, Hekesh is a little bit more powerful than a binyan av. Binyan av is mamish on the low end of the list. But on the other hand, you started with a hekesh. So a hekesh is stronger than a binyan av, and therefore it could be that that which is derived from a hekesh B is derived from A through a hekesh. Now B can teach C through a binyan av. Omer Rabbi Yirmiyah, if we're going to assume that a dover lomi behekesh chozer malami b'binyan av, then lo lichtov tzfona bi osham. We spoke about the fact that Kodesh Kodeshim requires Shechita and Kabbalah in the tzafon of the Azara, and the Torah specifies tzafon in the Ola case. In the Asham case, we derive from the pasuk that Asham has to be slaughtered and the Kabbalah Stam in the same place where the Ola is slaughtered, which means in the tzafon. Now, the Torah didn't have to go as far as deriving Asham, meaning Safon in Asham, from an equation to Ola, Teisiv Binyanam Mechatos. Asham is very, very similar to Chatos in the fact that both are coming for a kapara for a sin. And we have an equation in the Torah between Chatos and Asham. And therefore, if chatos, which is itself derived from ola, when I say derived, I'm referring again, I don't have to repeat myself over and over again to the halach of tzafon, then now what we can do is, since we have an equation between asham and chatos was derived from ola, then we should be able to derive asham from chatos. Why did the Torah have to go out of its way to tell me that the din of asham is equivalent to that of chatos? Lamai hilchsa kasve lav lememer isn't coming to teach me that davar alamed behekesh, meaning that chatos, which is derived from ola in a hekesh, cannot now teach and reveal the halacha of asham through a binyan. But the Gemara now is going to analyze whether or not you really have a fair conclusion to derive from the fact that the Torah had to specify that asham is equal to ola, and not derive it from chatos based on a binyan av, because let's wonder whether or not that binyan av is actually in and of itself valid. The Tamech Teisiv binyan av me ola, are you claiming that you can derive the halacha of Safon in Osham from Safon in Ola through a binyan Av, my Taimalo Asi, I'll tell you why that binyan Av would not be sufficient. Mishum dikal mifra mali Ola shekain kolil. So if you're going to take Ola as your paradigmic case of Tzafon and try to derive Osham in a binyan Av from Ola, that's not going to be a fair binyan Av because Ola is on the highest level in the whole matrix of Kodshim. Ola is unique in that there's no achilas basar li adam. It's all purely kolil al gabi mizbeach. So what gives you the right to derive the chumrah of the requirement of tzafon from Ola to Asham? Asham doesn't have kulei kolil. Asham is nechal l'zichrei kuhuna. Now, once you're going that far and you are rejecting a binyan av from Ola, then chatas nami ikul mifrach malachat shkem b'chad persel chayvi krisis. We know that Osham, I'm sorry, that Ola does not have the power of kapara. I mean, maybe it could be mechaper if you don't take a lulav, if you don't sit in the sukkah, you don't eat matzah on an essay, but it cannot certainly be mechaper on a lav. And in the case of chatos, it can be mechaper even on the most severe lav, a lav sheyesh bo kores. So basically, the Gemara is now saying that, you know what, your whole derivation here is based on the logic of binyan av, but there is no binyan av. There's no valid binyan av. Now, the Gemara says the following. Maybe it's possible to derive tzafon from what's called a tzad hashava. In other words, a binyan av means that you derive B from A. So if A has a chumrah that B doesn't have, that destroys, that's a pircha on the binyan av. But if you can create a tzad hashava, in which whatever pircha you attack, I'll bring you another case which has the same halacha and doesn't expose itself to that pircha. For example, maybe we could learn a third out of a combination of two. And now the Gemara is going to say, well, which third do you want to derive from which two? If you're going to tell me, lo nichtov rachmana ol, if the Torah had dropped the requirement of tzafon in the case of ola, and now we're going to derive the halacha of tzafon from a tzad hashava, equating chatos and asham. And then from chatos liyashim, you're going to come to ola. Ola is a very big paradox because on the one hand, ola is the most chamor of all kodshim. It's kula kolil. But on the other hand, ola is lacking the element of kapara. Is malahanach shkei mechaper. So any chumrah and any higher requirement that the Torah requires in chatos and asham could have no bearing on ola because ola is not a mechaper. So now let's try a different combination. Lo nichta rachmana b'chatos. Let's drop chatos v'teisei mehanach. We're going to introduce ola and asham. And the truth is that this is a very powerful tzad hashava because ola and asham really cover all the bases. And there's no real pircha that would block the ability for us to derive ola from a combination of asham and ola. I'm sorry, from asham and chatos. Again, we'll just go over one more time. Again, you have to write this out. Shot this out. Ola and asham. So we want to derive now chatos from ola and asham, and that's a very powerful and valid tzad hashava. But ma'alahanach kein zcharim. The Gemara has to push itself in here to the question of which kind of an animal, male or female, is royal carbon. In the case of chatos, as opposed to ola and asham, which are all from male animals. In the case of chatos, there's such things as chatos from an akeva. Okay, let's try another combination. Lo nichtav asham. Let's derive asham from a combo of ola and chatos. The problem with asham is that there's no such thing as an asham tzibur. It just doesn't exist. That's not on the face of the map as far as kodshim is concerned. But in both chatos and ola, you could bring an olas tzibur. You could bring a chatos tzibur. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to the question of what we could derive from that which itself was derived. Dover halomim v'gzeres shava mal shilami v'hekesh. Now, even though hekesh was a little bit lower on the echelon, and it doesn't really shine a candle to gzeres shava and kal vachomer, but nevertheless, since you began with gzeres shava, that gives it a certain power to move forward, and maybe now that which is derived from gzeres shava, it's almost as if it was explicit in the Torah, and that could teach you something through a hekesh. And the Gemara says, Omar Rav Papa. Okay, so now we have to slow down a little bit because this Rav Papa and Mar Zutra, who rejects Rav Papa, is going to be a focal point in this sugya. It's going to come up again and again. Omar Rav Papa. Now, Rav Papa is going to talk about a relationship between a korban shlomim and a korban toda. And the question is whether or not you can use money of Maser Sheni for buying a korban shlomim, buying a korban toda. V'zos Toras Zevach HaShlomim. The Torah says that shlomim and toda are very similar because toda, like shlomim, is not kodshe kodshim. And now we have a hekesh between shlomim and toda. Again, we have to write this on the whiteboard. Shlomim and toda is a hekesh. Now, we know that shlomim can be purchased from money of Maser Sheni. Normally, when you designate something for a mitzvah, then you have to use that money for the mitzvah, and you can't switch it to something else and use it for kicking off, fulfilling another mitzvah. It's dedicated to mitzvah A. But the Torah's machadish in the case of shlomim, that Maser Sheni, even though this was designated for the mitzvah Maser Sheni, could now be rechanneled for the sake of buying korban shlomim. And now, through the hekesh of korban toda to korban shlomim, we're going to derive the conclusion that likewise a korban toda could be purchased from money of Maser Sheni. Lamanu toda shebomin amaser min ashkan shlomim di asul mimaser. So again, we're going to see that we have a derivation that's going to teach us that you can use Maser Sheni money for shlomim. Now we're going to add a hekesh, and this hekesh, which is going to teach me that toda likewise could be brought from Maser Sheni geld, is going to shed a light here on the question that we asked as to whether something which is derived from gzeres shava, because we'll soon see that the Maser Sheni that can be used for shlomim is derived from gzeres shava. Now we're going to use shlomim, which was derived from gzeres shava, through the hekesh to teach us toda. And in my humble opinion, I think what's going on here is that the Gemara is trying to establish that gzeres shava is almost as if it was explicit in the Torah. Because the Gemara says, Shlomim gufayu minol, how do we know that you can designate Maser Sheni money to buy a korban shlomim? D'chsiv, a gzeres shava, which is called sham sham. And there are different psukim where the word sham appears. And one of those psukim is in Sefer Dvarim, Perek Chav Zayin. Another pasuk of Sham in Maser Sheni is in Parshas Re'eh in Perek Yud Daled. And Sham is going to teach you that just like you have a mitzvah of Maser Sheni, you can have a mitzvah of Maser Sheni that leads and culminates into Shlomim. Now we're going to take a hekesh from Toda to Shlomim, and we're going to derive that likewise in the case of Toda, you can use the money of Maser Sheni for the purchase of a korban Toda. So we see clearly, therefore, that Gzeir Shav is so powerful that which is derived from Gzeir Shav, in this case Shlomim li Maser Sheni, is now going to be the jump off from which we derive the conclusion that Toda through the Hekesh to Shlomim could likewise be purchased from Maser Sheni. But the Gemara doesn't like it. Now, in order to appreciate why the Gemara doesn't like it, we really should review back on Daf Mem Tes the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, because everything ultimately comes back to Rabbi Yochanan. See, in this Gemara you have to turn like page after page, and then hope you'll finally find it. But I'll just, while I'm looking for it, I'll just say out Balpeh what Rabbi Yochanan's point is. Rabbi Yochanan's point is that all these limitations in which you cannot derive C from B because B itself was derived from A, those rules apply only in Kodshim. Now, our sugya that we're learning right now on Daf Mem is focused on Maser Sheni. Maser Sheni is not Kodshim. Let me explain. Maser Sheni certainly has a status of Hegdesh, and it's Mom Gavah, but nevertheless, it's not a korban. It doesn't belong on the Mizbeach in any sense, in any shape or form. So therefore, okay, I found Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is on the bottom of Memtes Amid Beis, which we learned yesterday. Rabbi Yochanan, B'chal HaTorah Kul Lemeidim, Lamed Mi Lamad. So C could be derived from B, even though B is derived from A. That's in Kol HaTorah Kula. Chutz min HaKodshim. In Kodshim, says Rabbi Yochanan, the rule is, unless you know otherwise, I'm going to try to see that Gzeir Shava is the exception. Ein danim lamed mi lamed. We do not derive C from B, since B is itself a nilma. So that's Rabbi Yochanan. So now Mar Zutra says, Rav Papa, what are you hacking here? What are you hacking a China kid? Maser dagan chulin v'alma. Again, when we say chulin v'alma, don't take that literally. It's not chulin, it's sacred, it's kodesh, and you have to take it to Yerushalayim, and you have to eat a b'kedusha, b'tara, etc., etc. But it's not kodshim. It's not brought on the mizbeach. And Rabbi Yochanan has already taught me that we can derive anything that was derived from anything in kol HaTorah kulin chulin. Amalei, so now Ravina is going to go back to the turf of Rav Papa. So you can have Rav Papa and Ravina against Mar Zutra. Amar Amra, Lomad Kodesh and Melamed Kodesh. In other words, Rav Papa begins with the case of Maser. Right? Now, comes along Ravina to defend Rav Papa. He says, I don't care about A, meaning the original, which is Maser Sheni. I care about B and C. B is the case of Shlomim, and C is the case of Toda. So even though we're all deriving it from Maser, and Maser is the original Melamed, but nevertheless we're in the area of Kodshim. And therefore, Rav Papa's example of the Gzeir Shava, which is followed by a Hekesh, is a perfectly good example. So that if the Gzeir Shava starts with Shlomim and Maser Sheni, but now we're already in the turf of Shlomim, which is Kodshim, and now Shlomim wants to teach us something about Toda. Toda is also Kodshim. So we have to keep in mind as we go through this daf, especially on Amid Beis, that Mar Zutra is of the opinion that if you kick off the entire Chad Gadya with something that's chulin and not kodshim, then you have no proof, because there the lamed and the nilmad can teach each other. But on the other side of the fence, we have Rav Papa and now Ravina, and they are of the opinion that it doesn't matter where you kick it off, where you start from, it matters what you're deriving from it. Next, Dover Alami B'Gzeir Shava, which we said is very high on the totem pole, Ma'oshi Alami B'Gzeir Shava. And, intuitively, as a knee-jerk response, I would say that once you derive something from Gzeir Shava, you could derive from that thing which was derived from Gzeir Shava to another Gzeir Shava. Lama Rami Bar Chom. Okay, so in order to understand this Gemara about a korban Toda, we have to read a pasuk in Chumash, and the pasuk says the following. This is in Vayikra Perek Vav. Vizos Torah Zevach Hashlom Asher Yaakov Hashem Im Ala Toda Yakrivenu. So the Torah is clearly talking about carbon Toda. And the Torah says Vehikriv al Zevach HaToda. In other words, the Zevach itself, the animal that's brought, has to be accompanied by 40 lechamim, 40 breads. Some breads are leavened, are matzah, are chametz, and some are matzah. So 10 out of the 40 are matzah, and the other 30 are fermented, or leavened, or chametz. And the Torah says, chalos matzos bluos bashemen. Okay, we're not focused today on bluos bashemen. That's a sugya unto itself. We're focused on the next part of the pasuk, and that is miru beches. I'm sorry, soles is the key word here. So it says the following. So you have matzos, and then you have something called rikikim, which loosely translates as wafers. And then you have something called murbeches. Okay, that's a little complicated. Murbeches is literally translated as scalded, but again, it has to do with how you prepare the dough. So we're not going to go through that now. That's for learning Korban Toda. And finally, you have chalos. Okay. So now, when the Torah says soles, it's referring dafka to rechuva. I'm sorry, to revucha. I said rechuva, revucha. We're not riding a horse, revucha. And now the question is whether or not that requirement of soles, which is refined flour, applies to the other categories, 3 categories of Korban Toda. Tanya, we learned in a brisa. Soles murbeches. So the rechuva explicitly is described as soles, as refined flour. Lamadnu, so we see explicitly in the pasuk, l'rechuva sheba soles. That's how the Torah describes rechuva. But chalos minayin. And now we can learn chalos minayin, we can learn rekikim minayin, and we can learn matzos minayin. Is this requirement of refined flour applicable to all 4 categories of the Korban Toda? Let's say, for example, chalos. Now, chalos is also called, just one second. Matzos, because it says in the pasuk chalos matzos, so it's not leavened. So maybe in the case of revucha, which is leavened and scalded, that's where you require fine flour, meaning soles, but not necessarily in that which is not leavened, which is the case of chalos. So this halacha of requiring soles in chalos is going to be derived from Gzeira Shava. And from that Gzeira Shava, we're going to set up another Gzeira Shava to derive the halacha of refined flour in rikikim. So chalos, right? So the word chalos appears both with regard to the leavened, scalded loaves, and it appears again with regard to the unleavened loaves. And both require soles. So now the Brisa asks about Rikikim minayin. How do you know that Rikikim likewise requires soles? Talmud Lomar, another Gzeira Shava. So we're building one Gzeira Shava on top of another Gzeira Shava, and it's all kachim. Is matzos. Amalei Ravina. Ravina says the following. I'm not sure that that's exactly how you want to derive the halacha of requiring refined flour. Dilma, Omar of Mimayu, de matzos matz l'chalos gamar. How do you know that this Gzeira Shava of matz from chalos is the source from which we derive soles in the case of an unleavened bread? Dilma mimafe tanur go'amar. Okay, so Mafet Talmud takes us into the parsha of Karban Mincha, and the Torah in the case of Karban Mincha in Vayikra Perek Beis, the Torah says that we require solace. I find this a deficiency in this Gemara. They don't bring the pasuk always. Just 1 second. Okay, sorry. Let's just open up to the Chumash and see the Parsha of Mincha. Oh, B'nefesh ki sakriv korban mincha Lashem, soles yeh korbono. So we're talking about a korban mincha, and the korban mincha requires solace. A lot of other things that are required in korban mincha. For that, you have to learn Masechta Menachos. But one thing is clear from the pasuk, and that's what's relevant to us, that it requires solace. And that's called the Parsha of Mafei Tanur, which is, again, the Parsha of Mincha. Now, the very subtle point in this Gemara is that we're not, according to Ravina, we're not basing one Gzeira Shava on another Gzeira Shava, but rather the two separate Gzeira Shavas. Each one is independent of the other one. So again, if you're talking about Revucha in the case of a korban toda, okay, that we're going to derive from the Gzeira Shava of the loaves that are unleavened. Fine. But now, when you're deriving the case of Rikikim, so that's going to be derived from Mafeh in the Korban Mincha, Mafeh Tanur. So that's a totally different Gzeira Shava. They're completely independent one of the other. Rava says the following: Tanya, v'kirbo v'pirsha v'hotzi. Okay, so now we're learning the halacha of what's called nituach v'hafshata. So now we're going to start with the paro shel Kohen Gadol, right? The Kohen Gadol's par is in Vayikra Perek Dalid, and we require after the shechita that we take out the par outside of the entire machna, and there we burn it. And the question is, do we burn it piecemeal or the entire body of the bull in one shot? And it says v'kirbo upirsho v'hotzi. V'hotzi means take it out. Take it out means take it out as a whole. Malamit shemotzio sholim. Yochol yisrafenu l'sholim. Okay, so you took it out of the machna sholim rather than dismembering it. And now the question is, we're up to the stage of sreifa, of burning it. And how do we know that the sreifa is going to take place with each part of the body of the bull separately? Nemar kan rosho ukrov, v'nemar lahalan rosho ukrov, ma lahalan al yedei nituach, af kan al yedei nituach. So the paradigm case of nituach is the parsha of Ola, and in the parsha of Ola it says Rosho Ukrov, and likewise in the parsha the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol it says Rosho Ukrov, and therefore just like Ola requires nituach, which means he has to dismember the body and take apart each separate each part. Afkan, so too, in the case of Parashal Kohen Gadol, you need to dismember, which is called Nituah. Now, as I said before, there are two issues here. There's Nituach, and then there's Hafshata. Hafshata means to take off the or. I mala halan b'hefshet af kan nami b'hefshet. Should we say that if this Gzeres Shava of Rosho Krov equates the avoda of the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol with that of an Ola, then let's go even a step further. Just like an Ola requires Hafshata, right? You have to take off the skin of the animal. So too, the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol, before you burn it, you have to take off the skin. Talmud Lama v'kirbo upirsho. And from this pasuk, somehow, we're going to derive the conclusion that there's no afshat in the case of Paro Shel Kohen Gadol. My Talmudo, what did you see in the pasuk v'kirbo upirsho? Amar of Papa kishem shepirsho b'kirbo, kach b'saro bi'oro. So just like in the case of Nituach, we said that after you take out the bull whole, then you chop it up into its pieces for the sreifa. Now, when you chop up the bull, you're going to end up with something called pirsho. I'm not sure exactly what pirsho is. I think it's like feces. Anyway, it's something very disgusting. So therefore, the Torah says that, you know what? You don't have to remove this disgusting pirsha and burn it separately. When you take apart the parts of the animal, you can leave the pirsha inside and then burn it as is. And we're going to derive from that, because it says kirbo u pirsho, that since the perish is left inside the animal, and that's called bikirbo, so too we don't remove the skin of the animal as we do in a korban olah, but we leave the basar with its or together as one entity and we burn it together. Okay, fine. So again, we're still halfway there, and we have this first Gzeres Shava to teach us from Rosho Ukroev that just like in Ola, you require Nituach, which means that you take apart the members of the body. So too, in the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol, like the Korban Ola, we require Nituach to take it apart. And now we're going to introduce another Gzeres Shava. This is where Rava is going to derive his conclusion. Vesanya, and we learned in another Brisa, Rebbe presents a different Gzeres Shava. Rebbe Omer Nemerkan or Ubasar Uperesh. In the parsha of the Parashal Kohen Gadol, the Torah mentions all the above. And again, here we're going to have to open up the Chumash. Just 1 minute. Maybe here I can find the pasuk. Yeah, I think he has the pasuk here. Okay, fine. It says Rebbe v'nemer lahalan or basar uperish, and also in the parsha of Paro Shel Kohen Gadol, again, we're going to have to start with the Yom Kippur parsha in Achremos, and we're going to talk about the special korbanos on Yom Kippur, the Parvis Sa'ir, and in the Parvis Sa'ir it says Or Basar Uperesh, and so too in the parsha of the par of the Kohen Gadol also it says Or Basar Uperesh.